or your agent can pull that for you. Okay, let's get into leads. And this, other than determining value, your ability to get leads is going to determine whether you make any money at this business or not. I mean, flat out. If you cannot get consistent leads from motivated sellers, you will not do wholesale deals. Seriously. You can find, and let me use that house on Stephen. That house has been on the ugly radar for a long time. That house has been ugly for 8 years. Okay? I got to know the neighbor of the house, and I got to hear probably more than what I needed to. But it wasn't a problem until it was ugly and vacant. Once it was ugly and vacant, now it's a problem. So it's about getting there at the right point. Okay? When I got started, that's what I did on my own. I drove neighborhoods looking for those ugly, vacant houses. And my wife Lori and I, we would drive around in the Saturn on a weekend, and I'd take the left side, she'd take the right side, and we had our little map with us and a highlighter, and we'd highlight the streets as we drove up and down the blocks, and we'd keep a little list of all the ugly, vacant houses. Okay? So, ugly is great, and we would market to those people, but ugly and vacant, that's really where the opportunity is. Okay? And REOs, and what I mean by REO, does everybody know what an REO is? And not the band REO Speedwagon, but the REO stands for real estate owned. Okay? Synonymous with a bank foreclosure. Property that once it's been foreclosed on, the bank takes it back, it becomes real estate owned, and then the bank is trying to liquidate the house, typically through the MLS or through an auction, one of the auction websites. Now, there are a ton of bank properties, but the banks are going to make it a lot more difficult for you to do what you want to do as a wholesaler. Okay, don't let that get you down. I do have an agreement in here that you can basically get around their loopholes, but it's still tougher to deal with them. Okay, they won't allow an assignable contract. Okay, well, an individual, they don't care. Half of them don't even know what that means anyway. They just want the house sold, and you're going to provide that solution. A bank, for whatever reason, they have a problem with wholesalers making money on a deal. Now, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me because typically the people that list those properties don't do a lot to market them. Okay? Now, if they let wholesalers do it, you got somebody that doesn't make any money. They're paid on performance, right? Wouldn't it behoove them to let wholesalers make a buck on their property because they're going to move them a whole lot quicker with no marketing expense? I mean, not really. They're paying for the marketing out of the wholesaler's fee, but time is money. And the longer the bank holds those properties on their books, but that's my whole soapbox speech. Anyway, their objective is, and I'm guessing politically, they don't want to be known as the people that sells their properties for less than what they're worth. Because ultimately, if the wholesaler is able to make money on it, aren't they kind of really selling it less than what they could get? Well, they don't want to admit that, the big, dumb, slow-moving machine can't operate as well as the quick and nimble wholesaling machine can. But so you can't assign them. For a while, we just used to double close. I would get a property from a seller or from the bank, and then I'd go find a buyer. The buyer would have the cash. I would structure a buy transaction here. We'd go to the title company, or sometimes even a different title company, and we would simultaneously close both transactions. And I'd use the money from this transaction to fund this transaction, and I'd just get paid the spread in the middle. Okay? Now, what I'm going to teach you today mostly is you get the contract, you get a piece of paper, sign with the seller, and you sell your contract to the buyer, and the buyer closes. So you're not actually ever in title as the wholesaler. Okay? Does that make sense? Now, when you do a double close, you actually go into title, if nothing more than for a couple of minutes until the other transaction closes. But you are in title, and that is an actual real estate transaction. Okay? Which can have some different tax consequences, yes?
You'll probably get to this later, but what's the difference between signing, you're selling the contract, and then assigning?
Well, if you're assigning, you're not really doing a real estate transaction. If you're double closing, you're doing a real estate transaction. And if you do a lot of double closing, you're basically a dealer of property, and you don't necessarily want to be the entity. You want to be like my C Corp entity is a dealer. It buys and sells. My LLCs, they are treated as investors. They hold property for long term, and there's big tax consequences for being a dealer. You lose depreciation. You lose the ability to exchange a property. You lose a lot of benefits that by being a dealer. Okay. So do you need to worry about that on your first transaction? No, not at all. And you can do a lot of them, especially if you have earned income, like from a day job. You can do a lot of transactions and still not have to worry about being a dealer. But at some point, again, the way we started the day, let's treat this like a business. Let's actually operate in a business entity. Okay. Now, we used to double close. Now the banks kind of got wise to that game. So now they have their little 24 to 4,000 page addendums that you got to sign, and then they also have the title companies. They force the title companies not to allow them to use a simultaneously close to fund your transaction. Okay, do you understand what I mean? Now you still have to have your money to close on your transaction, even if you have a buyer sitting in the next room over there with funds in excess of what your transaction is. They won't. So now you either have to use your cash to actually close and go into title, or you use flash cash. And flash cash is basically, it's like hard money for 5 minutes, or for a day sometimes. You just have to be in title long enough to sell to the next person, and you have to have your own funds. But guess what? Those funds cost money. And you may pay a point and a half, 2 points is pretty common for flash cash. So if you're making a $5,000 wholesale on a $100,000 property, and you pay 2 points, there went $2,000 of your $5,000 deal. It gets pretty anorexic, meaning thin. Okay, thin profits. It's a little too risky, right? So I can't tell you. I've never flipped MLS properties or bank-owned properties, but I don't do volume there. There are some wholesalers that do volume. They're typically doing $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 assignments on those transactions. Okay, so I mean, can you see? You gotta have a lot of moving parts to make a lot of offers on a lot of REOs. Okay, so you gotta have a whole lot more complication. You have to have likely employees, okay, to keep that machine going, and you've got to have a lot more time invested to make less money. Okay. But if you want to know how to make those happen when you do get the good deal, it's you basically convert a real property transaction into a personal property transaction. Okay? And you go into contract using a trust or an LLC entity on the contract to buy the REO. Okay? Are you with me so far? So it's not you, and it's not your normal entity that you do business as. It's a new entity that you just created on the Secretary of State's website for $50. You write your offer gets accepted, and now you assign that you sell that LLC for a fee. And the only asset that LLC has is its right to buy this other property. Does that make sense? Same thing with the trust. Trust is easier, but a lot of people, even seasoned investors, don't have a grasp of trusts. So you have to get over that roadblock of them understanding what it is and having a warm, fuzzy feeling about dealing with you, whereas most buyers are going to be familiar with an LLC, and my LLC agreement in here is very good. It was not an inexpensive document to draft, and basically it covers the same points, but it's dealing with selling an LLC, not selling a contract, not dealing with a trust. And ultimately, now you sell your LLC, and then your buyer then closes with that same LLC. It's still their property. It's just they're closing in an LLC that they just bought. Does that make sense?